Imagine waking up before sunrise every single day, knowing that today might be the day the mountain kills you. Not because of an accident, not because of bad luck, but because someone handed you a basket, pointed at a cliff face, and said, "Dig." No safety equipment, no legal protections, and wages that were, depending on the year, somewhere between a third and half of what the man working right next to you was earning. For the exact same work, sometimes harder work, that was life for tens of thousands of Chinese immigrants who built the western half of the First Transcontinental Railroad in the 1860s. A railroad that literally connected a nation. A railroad that presidents called a miracle of modern engineering. A railroad that, when it was completed in 1869, made the men who financed it extraordinarily wealthy and famous. And you probably already know those men's names. Leland Stanford, Charles Crocker, Mark Hopkins, Collis Huntington. But do you know the names of the men who actually built it? Today, we're going back. We're stepping into the boots, well, the sandals, of a Chinese worker on the Central Pacific Railroad sometime around 1865. We're going to see what daily life actually looked like, what they ate, how they survived, what they were paid, what killed them, and why, even after all of it, so many of them stayed. This isn't just railroad history. This is the story of one of the most remarkable and most overlooked groups of workers in American history. Let's get into it. First, some context, because you really can't understand this story without it. By the early 1860s, California had been a U.S. state for just over a decade. The gold rush had already happened, peaked, and started fading. San Francisco was growing fast. Sacramento was booming, and there was this enormous, ambitious, almost insane idea floating around. What if you connected the entire country by rail? Before the railroad, getting from the East Coast to California meant either a brutal overland wagon journey that took months and killed a significant percentage of people who tried it, or a sea voyage that went all the way around the tip of South America, which took even longer. Neither option was great, so in 1862, President Lincoln signed the Pacific Railroad Act, and two companies got the job. The Union Pacific would build westward from Omaha, Nebraska. The Central Pacific would build eastward from Sacramento, California, over the Sierra Nevada mountains and across the Nevada and Utah deserts. The Central Pacific's piece of the job was, by most assessments, the harder one. The Sierra Nevada mountains weren't just a challenge. They were a wall, a massive granite wall standing between California and the rest of the continent. And that's where our story begins. Now, who actually worked for the Central Pacific in the early days? Mostly Irish immigrants and other white laborers. There was no shortage of workers in California. The problem was keeping them. California in the 1860s was a place of opportunity. Gold might be running thin, but there were other jobs, other ventures, other possibilities. Workers would sign on with the railroad, earn some wages, and then leave for something better the moment it presented itself. Charles Crocker, who was overseeing construction for the Central Pacific, was constantly frustrated by the turnover. He needed a reliable, large workforce that would stick around. In 1865, someone, accounts differ on exactly who, suggested hiring Chinese workers. Crocker was initially skeptical. The common prejudice of the era was that Chinese men were small, not physically suited for hard labor, not up to the challenge of railroad construction. Crocker eventually agreed to a trial. He hired about 50 Chinese workers to see how they performed. They performed extraordinarily well. Within months, Crocker was actively recruiting Chinese workers from across California and eventually directly from China itself. By 1867, somewhere between 10,000 and 15,000 Chinese men, some estimates go higher, were working for the Central Pacific. They made up roughly 80 to 90% of the entire workforce. So, who were these men? Most came from Guangdong Province in southeastern China, particularly from the Pearl River Delta region around Guangzhou. Many were from a specific cluster of counties. The sea or Four Counties region. They spoke Cantonese. They had their own customs, their own social structures, their own food preferences. A large number of them had already been in California for years before the railroad. They'd come during the gold rush. Some had worked as miners, others as cooks, laundrymen, merchants, domestic servants. They knew California. They'd experienced American prejudice firsthand, and they'd developed a reputation, not always fairly, often grudgingly, as reliable, hard-working, and organized. They also had something the railroad desperately needed. They were willing to do the work. So let's place ourselves in this story now. You're a man in your 20s. Most of these workers were young, many in their late teens or 20s. You've made the journey from Guangdong province across the Pacific, a crossing that took weeks and was deeply unpleasant. You've arrived in San Francisco, which the Chinese community called Gamsan, Gold Mountain. You have family here, or at least people from your home district. The Chinese community in California was tightly organized around these regional and village connections, and those networks matter. They're often how you got this job in the first place. A labor contractor, often Chinese himself, acting as an intermediary between the workers and the railroad, has arranged your employment. You'll be paid roughly $26 to $35 a month, depending on the period and the job. That sounds like not much, but in the 1860s it was a workable wage. The catch? You pay for your own food and supplies. White workers on the same railroad received the same wages, but had their food and lodging covered by the company, meaning they actually took home more. That disparity was real, documented, and deeply unfair. But we'll come back to it. You've heard the railroad is hard work. You've heard men have been hurt, but you've also heard that the pay is steady, steadier than mining, and that thousands of your countrymen are already out there. So you go. The journey from San Francisco to the work camps takes you east, up into the foothills of the Sierra Nevada. The landscape changes dramatically as you climb. The flat farmland of the Sacramento Valley gives way to rolling hills, covered in oak trees, then to pine forests, then to something that doesn't look like California at all. Granite peaks, snowfields, narrow gorges where rivers cut through stone. The camps themselves are organized and surprisingly orderly, partly because the Chinese workers organized themselves. They traveled in crews, typically of about 20 to 30 men, each crew with its own headman who handled communication with the white overseers, managed the internal logistics of the group. This structure meant that the railroad essentially contracted with these groups rather than with individuals, which gave the workers a degree of collective organization that was unusual for laborers of that era. The camps had tents, later wooden structures. There were cooks, there was food, and the food was one of the things that genuinely distinguished the Chinese workers from their Irish counterparts, in ways that actually affected their health. Here's something that doesn't get talked about enough. The food. Chinese workers on the Central Pacific ate very differently from white workers, and this difference almost certainly contributed to better health outcomes. While white workers ate a diet heavy in salt pork, beans, bread, and coffee, a diet that was calorie-dense but nutritionally limited, Chinese workers ate a more varied diet that they largely prepared themselves. They ate rice as a staple. They ate dried oysters, dried abalone, dried fish, bamboo shoots, mushrooms, dried fruit, tofu, peanuts, seaweed. They drank tea. The tea part is significant. Tea required boiling water, which meant the Chinese workers were regularly consuming water that had been purified. White workers often drank directly from streams and rivers, which in a work camp environment could be heavily contaminated. Dysentery and other waterborne illnesses were serious killers in the 19th century. Historians have noted that the Chinese workers' lower rates of some of these illnesses may be at least partly attributable to the habit of drinking boiled tea rather than raw water. The food was brought in by Chinese merchants who had recognized a business opportunity. Supply wagons from San Francisco and Sacramento made regular runs to the work camps. This wasn't charity, it was commerce. But it created a supply chain that meant the Chinese workers maintained a diet that was, by the standards of the time, reasonably nutritious. So what does a typical day look like? You're up before dawn. The sun comes up early in the mountains in summer, which is when most of the Sierra work was done, and there's no benefit to sleeping in. You eat. Rice, probably, with whatever accompaniment is available. Tea, always tea. Then you work. The hours are long, typically from first light to last light, which in a California summer means 12 to 14 hours of physical labor. There's a break for midday. There might be shorter breaks during the day, but this isn't a modern construction site with scheduled rest periods. The work depends on where you are in the process. Early on, it might be clearing trees and brush from the right-of-way, the path the railroad will follow. Then grading, leveling the ground, cutting into hillsides, filling in valleys, building the flat roadbed the tracks will rest on, then laying tracks, driving spikes, setting ties, and through all of this, the hardest work of all, blasting. The Sierra Nevada mountains were the central challenge of the entire Transcontinental Railroad project. Not just a challenge, an almost impossible barrier. The granite of the Sierra Nevada is some of the hardest rock on Earth. You can't dig through it the way you dig through soil. You have to blast it. And blasting in the 1860s meant black powder, the same basic explosive technology that had been used for centuries. Black powder worked, but it was slow, inefficient, and dangerous. The work went like this. Workers would drill holes into the rock face by hand. One man holding a long steel drill, another swinging a hammer, rotating the drill a fraction of a turn between each hammer strike. This was called single jack drilling if one man did both, double jack if one held and one hammered. Either way, it was exhausting, precise work, and a slip of the hammer meant a shattered hand or worse. The holes were filled with black powder, a fuse was set, and everyone ran. The blast would break loose some amount of rock, which then had to be cleared by hand, shovels and wheelbarrows and those characteristic wicker baskets. Before the process could begin again, progress was measured in inches per day, literally inches. At Cape Horn, a dramatic cliff face above the American River Canyon, progress was so slow and the terrain so difficult that workers were reportedly lowered down the cliff face in wicker baskets to hand drill holes and set charges in the rock while suspended hundreds of feet above the river. This image, the wicker baskets, has become one of the iconic images of Chinese railroad labor. There's some debate among historians about exactly how widely this technique was used versus other methods like wooden scaffolding, but there's solid evidence that it happened. Workers suspended on ropes or in baskets, drilling into sheer cliff faces, doing work that had no precedent and no safety net. Literally no safety net. Then came the tunnels. The Central Pacific had to bore through the summit of the Sierra Nevada. There was no going around it. The mountain was simply too high and too wide. The solution was to tunnel through the granite. The summit tunnel near Donner Pass was the most famous and most difficult. It ran about 1,659 feet through solid granite. In 1866, with the summer construction season giving way to fall and then winter, and the tunnel still far from complete, the Central Pacific made a decision that shows just how desperately they needed to maintain progress. They sent crews to work in the tunnel through the winter, around the clock, 3 shifts a day, 7 days a week. The winter of 1866 to 1867 was one of the worst on record in the Sierra Nevada. By some accounts, over 40 feet of snow fell. Workers were buried alive in snow avalanches. Some of their bodies weren't found until spring, when the snow melted enough to reveal them, still in their work clothes, still holding their tools. Inside the tunnel, the work continued regardless of what was happening outside. It was dark, lit only by candles and later oil lanterns. The air was thick with smoke and dust and the acrid residue of black powder blasts. Every blast had to be followed by ventilation time before workers could re-enter to clear debris. Temperatures inside the granite were actually relatively stable. Cold, but not the brutal cold of the mountain surface. But the psychological weight of working inside a dark tunnel under hundreds of feet of rock, with the mountain groaning and settling around you, was its own kind of burden. Progress through the summit tunnel averaged about 1.5 feet per day at best. The crews worked from both ends simultaneously, trying to meet in the middle. The mathematics of getting them to meet precisely required careful surveying and no small amount of luck. When the two crews finally broke through to each other, the alignment was reportedly off by only a couple of inches. In 1866, with the tools available in 1866. That's actually remarkable. Now here's where the story takes a turn that not enough people know about. Black powder was slow. The Central Pacific was behind schedule. So they tried something new, something experimental, something that the scientific community was still figuring out in real time: nitroglycerin. Alfred Noble had only recently started working on ways to stabilize nitroglycerin. His work on dynamite was still a few years away. The Central Pacific started experimenting with liquid nitroglycerin in the tunnels in 1866. It was dramatically more powerful than black powder. Progress rates improved, but nitroglycerin was, to put it plainly, terrifying. Unlike black powder, which had to be ignited to explode, nitroglycerin could detonate from shock, from dropping it, from a sudden temperature change, from no obvious cause at all. The crews working with it knew they were handling something that could kill them without warning. And sometimes it did. Exactly how many men died from nitroglycerin accidents on the Central Pacific is unknown. Record-keeping was inconsistent. Deaths of Chinese workers were often recorded differently than deaths of white workers, sometimes not recorded at all. But it happened, and the workers knew it happened. The Central Pacific eventually shifted to manufacturing nitroglycerin on-site near the tunnels, rather than transporting it from San Francisco, after incidents along the transportation route made the danger clear. It was a practical solution, but the men working in and around that production were, once again, the ones taking the risk. Here's the thing about all of this. The Chinese workers knew the risks. They weren't naive. They'd seen men hurt. They'd seen men die. And yet they kept working, partly because the wages were genuinely useful, partly because the alternative was often no work at all, and partly, and this is the part that I think gets lost in the economic analysis, because there was real pride in what they were doing. This was the railroad. It was the biggest construction project in American history. Everyone knew it. And these men, despite being treated as lesser, despite being denied the recognition they deserved, despite working under conditions that no amount of money could fully justify, they knew they were building something that mattered. You can't tell this story honestly without talking about what happened in June of 1867. After months of brutal tunnel work, after the horrific winter, after watching colleagues die and watching the disparity between their wages and white workers' compensation continue, the Chinese workers did something that was genuinely radical for the era. They went on strike. It wasn't a spontaneous walkout, it was organized. The workers, through their crew headmen and community networks, coordinated across the work camps. Their demands were clear: equal pay with white workers, an increase from around $35 to $40 a month, a reduction in the working day in the tunnels from 10 hours to 8 hours. The dangerous conditions underground made the longer shifts particularly brutal, and limits on the number of hours they could be required to work. These were not unreasonable demands. They were, by any measure, fair. Charles Crocker's response was swift and, from his perspective, decisive. He refused to negotiate. Then he threatened to bring in recently freed black workers from the South as replacements. Then he did something that was particularly cruel. He cut off the supply of food to the striking workers. Remember, Unlike white workers whose food was covered by the company, Chinese workers bought their own food from the supply wagons. Cutting off the supply wagons wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a direct threat to survival. The strike lasted about a week, maybe slightly longer, accounts vary. Without the ability to hold out, no savings, no alternative food source, no legal protections, and no broader labor movement to back them up. The workers returned. The Central Pacific made minimal concessions. Wages were raised slightly, but not to equality. The 10-hour tunnel shifts remained. By any immediate measure, the strike failed. But here's why it matters. It happened. Chinese workers in 1867, in the middle of the Sierra Nevada mountains, with no legal standing, no union, no political allies, organized a collective labor action to demand fair treatment. In the context of the era, that was extraordinary. It took until 2014 for the state of California to formally recognize the strike. And it took until 2021 for the U.S. Congress to pass the Chinese Exclusion Act, Repeal and Apology Act, acknowledging the role and the mistreatment of Chinese railroad workers, a bill that, as of my knowledge cutoff, had passed the Senate but not the full Congress. The recognition has been slow, and it has been incomplete. Let's talk about what it actually meant to be in danger on this job. Because it's easy to say dangerous work and move on. But the specific ways men died on this railroad tell you something important about the work. Explosions were the obvious one. Black powder, and then nitroglycerin in the wrong hands or under the wrong conditions. Men were killed outright or injured in ways that were debilitating. Lost fingers, lost hands, damaged hearing, eye injuries from flying rock. Cave-ins were another constant threat, especially in the tunnels. Rock is not perfectly stable. A blast that seemed complete might loosen material that fell later. Workers clearing debris from a blast zone were sometimes caught by secondary collapses. Avalanches in the winter. Men buried, suffocated, or simply swept off cliffs by walls of moving snow. Heat and dehydration during the desert crossing in Nevada and Utah, which came after the Sierra Nevada was conquered. The desert had its own brutal character. No shade, no water, temperatures that could kill. Accidents with equipment. Rail laying was mechanized enough that heavy materials were moving constantly, and men were injured by falling ties, derailed work cars, and simple construction site accidents. And then there were the conditions that weren't dramatic, but were still deadly. Respiratory illness from working in dusty, smoky tunnels without any breathing protection. Illness from contaminated water that even the tea habit couldn't fully protect against. Injuries that became infected in an era before antibiotics. The cumulative physical toll of years of hard labor in difficult conditions on bodies that needed rest and medical care they often didn't receive. How many men died? This is a question historians are still trying to answer, and the honest answer is that we don't fully know. The Central Pacific's records were incomplete, inconsistent, and in some cases appear to have been lost or destroyed. Chinese community organizations kept their own records, but those too are incomplete. Estimates range from hundreds to over 1,000 deaths among Chinese workers on the Central Pacific during construction. Some scholars believe the number may be significantly higher. In 2021, a project at Stanford University called the Chinese Railroad Workers in North America Project, which has been working for years to document these workers and their lives, concluded that the death toll was likely significant but remains difficult to quantify precisely. The physical evidence continues to surface. In 2020, archaeological work near the old Central Pacific route found Chinese worker artifacts, tools, ceramics, remnants of camp life, that provide tangible evidence of their presence in places the records don't fully document. There's also the matter of the remains themselves. Many Chinese workers who died on the railroad were buried near where they fell. The Chinese community, through the 6 companies, a powerful Chinese-American civic organization, organized efforts to return remains to China for proper burial, which was deeply important in Chinese cultural and religious tradition. The idea of being buried far from home, without proper rites, was genuinely distressing, and the effort to recover and repatriate remains was a significant undertaking. In 1870, a shipment of about 20,000 pounds of bones, estimated to be the remains of around 1,200 individuals, was sent from California to China. 20,000 pounds. Let that number sit with you for a moment. On May 10, 1869, at Promontory Summit in Utah Territory, the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific met. Governor Stanford drove the ceremonial golden spike. Photographs were taken. Telegrams were sent across the country. Done was the message transmitted, and the whole country celebrated. Look at those photographs from Promontory Summit. Look carefully. You can see crowds of workers and officials gathered around the 2 locomotives facing each other. The champagne is flowing, men are shaking hands. How many Chinese workers can you see in those photographs? Almost none. Possibly none. The men who did the most dangerous work, who built through the hardest terrain, who spent years in those tunnels. They were not in the official photographs. They were not invited to the ceremony. Their names were not mentioned in the speeches. Leland Stanford's speech at the completion of the railroad did not mention Chinese workers. The popular mythology of the Transcontinental Railroad, as it developed in the decades that followed, largely erased them. So what happened to the Chinese workers after the railroad was done? Many of them stayed in the West. Some moved to other railroad projects. The Southern Pacific, the Northern Pacific, and other rail lines that were built in the years and decades after the Transcontinental. Chinese labor was in demand for railroad construction for years, partly because of the demonstrated competence and organization of the crews. Others moved into agriculture, laundry, domestic service, restaurant work, the industries that the Chinese-American community became associated with in the latter half of the 19th century, often not by choice, but because those were the sectors where discrimination was slightly less extreme, or where Chinese workers had built enough of a market position to sustain themselves. Others returned to China. The dream for many had always been to earn enough money to go home, buy land, and support their families. Some achieved this. Many did not earn nearly enough. And then came something that should make anyone who knows this history feel genuine anger and grief. In 1882, the United States Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act. It was the first, and remains the only, law in American history to ban immigration from a specific country based solely on ethnicity. The same country whose western half these men had stitched together with iron rails said, "You are not welcome here. You cannot become citizens, and if you leave, you may not come back." The Chinese Exclusion Act was not repealed until 1943, and even then, the repeal allowed only minimal immigration. Full immigration rights were not restored until the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. So the men who built the western half of the Transcontinental Railroad, the men who completed what many considered the greatest engineering achievement in American history to that point, were rewarded, ultimately, with a law that treated their entire ethnic group as a threat to be excluded. That's not a metaphor. That's not hyperbole. That's what happened. We've been talking about Chinese workers as a group, and that's necessary because that's how the history happened. In groups, in crews, in a collective experience. But it's worth pausing to think about the individuals. Who were these men, really? Most had names that the English-speaking record keepers either couldn't or didn't bother to write down accurately. Many appear in records simply as John or Chinaman or no name at all. This erasure from the historical record was itself a form of dehumanization, and it makes the work of historians trying to recover their stories genuinely difficult. What we know from letters, from community records, from oral histories passed down through families, from the occasional diary or account that survives, is that these were young men with families. Most were not single adventurers. They had wives, parents, siblings, children back in Guangdong. They sent money home regularly through the community banking networks that had developed to serve the Chinese diaspora in California. That money, month after month, built houses and bought farmland, and funded the education of children in villages in southern China. There are villages in Guangdong today that owe their physical existence, their buildings, their infrastructure, their historical prosperity, to money sent back from men working on American railroads in the 1860s. They wrote letters. The letters were often formal by modern standards, focused on practical matters because that was the epistolary convention of the time. But sometimes you catch a glimpse of something more personal, a man asking his father to take care of his health, a man worried about his son's education, a man asking his wife to be patient. The work will be done soon. He will come home. Some of them had remarkable skills beyond physical labor. They were engineers in practice, if not in title. They understood rock, terrain, logistics. One of the things Charles Crocker eventually acknowledged, somewhat grudgingly, was that his Chinese workers had demonstrated problem-solving abilities and adaptability that went beyond what the work theoretically required. When a particular challenge arose, a particularly difficult rock formation, a tricky grading problem, the experienced Chinese crews often figured out the solution. They were also, many of them, literate. Chinese literacy rates in the 19th century were higher than often assumed, at least among the merchant and farming classes that much of this workforce came from. Men who were literate wrote letters and kept records. Men who weren't literate found others in the camp who could write for them. They had music. They had gambling, which was a significant part of working-class Chinese social life of the era. They had religious practices, Buddhism, Taoism, folk religion, that they maintained as best they could in the camps. They celebrated the Lunar New Year. They maintained the social structures, the clan and village associations, that were the backbone of Chinese community organization. They were, in short, fully human, fully complex people living extraordinary lives under extraordinary circumstances. Here's a question worth sitting with. What do we owe these men? The Transcontinental Railroad transformed the United States. It made California economically integrated with the rest of the country. It opened the Great Plains to agricultural settlement, with complicated and often devastating consequences for the indigenous peoples who had lived there. It made the transportation of goods, people, and mail across the continent practical for the first time. It created enormous wealth. The Chinese workers who built the western half of that railroad did not share in that wealth. They were paid less than white workers, given no legal protections, denied the ability to become citizens, and eventually excluded from the country entirely. The corporations that built the railroad, and the men who ran them, became extraordinarily wealthy and politically powerful. Leland Stanford used his railroad fortune to found Stanford University, which still bears his name. He served as California's governor and as a U.S. senator. The railroad magnates of the 19th century were among the most powerful private citizens in American history. None of that wealth came with acknowledgement of who actually built the thing. The California legislature passed a resolution in 2014 recognizing the Chinese railroad workers. In 2019, the U.S. Senate passed a resolution acknowledging their contributions on the 150th anniversary of the railroad's completion. The Stanford Center for Preservation of Chinese American Heritage is actively working to document and preserve this history. There are memorials at Promontory Summit now that include the Chinese workers in the story. These are real steps, and they matter. But they come 150 years late, after the men themselves lived and died without recognition, after their descendants spent generations carrying a history that the broader American narrative kept pushing aside. What would actual recognition look like? Historians and descendants of Chinese railroad workers have raised this question seriously. Some have called for formal congressional apology, formal inclusion of this history in national educational curricula, permanent memorials at the major sites, Cape Horn, Donner Pass, Promontory Summit, that explicitly center the Chinese workers. These conversations are ongoing. Let's slow down for a minute and just try to inhabit this experience. Not the big historical picture, just a single ordinary moment. It's early morning, sometime in the summer of 1866. You're at the Donner Summit work camp, elevation over 7,000 feet. The air is cold even though it's July, because at this altitude it's always a little cold at night. You've slept in a tent or a wooden bunkhouse with a couple dozen other men. It smells like unwashed bodies and wood smoke and the residue of yesterday's black powder blasts, which you can never quite get out of your nose. You eat breakfast. Rice, some salted fish, tea. The tea is hot, and that's genuinely comforting in the cold morning air. Then you walk to the tunnel entrance. The summit tunnel is not finished yet. It's a dark hole in the mountain, getting longer every day but still far from complete. You pick up your tools, a drill, a hammer, a candle lantern. You walk in. The light drops away behind you. There's a faint glow from the lanterns of the men ahead of you. The walls of the tunnel are wet. Water seeps through the granite constantly. It drips on your head and runs down the walls. Your feet are wet almost immediately. The rock face at the end of the tunnel is 10 hours of drilling away. You find your spot on the crew. One man holds the drill against the rock, another swings the hammer. You rotate between these rolls. The noise is constant. Metal on metal, metal on rock, the dull thud of the hammer, the sharp ring of the drill. Your ears ring with it by midday. Around you, in the flickering lamplight, you can see your crewmates. Some of them are from your home village back in Guangdong. Some are from neighboring counties. You know their families, or you know of them. You share a dialect, shared references, shared food. In the strange isolating environment of the tunnel, under an American mountain, thousands of miles from home, this small community is what keeps you grounded. At the end of a drilling cycle, the powder is packed, the fuse is set, and you move back. Everyone moves back as far as the tunnel length allows, which isn't that far. The blast is deafening even through your hands covering your ears. Rock falls. Dust fills the air so thickly you can't see. You wait for the air to clear enough to go back and see what the blast accomplished. Maybe 1.5 feet of progress, maybe 2 feet on a good day. You'll do this again, and again, and again. For months, or a bit, you can see for miles. The valleys a bit, you can see for miles. The valleys below, the range stretching north and south as far as you can see. It's genuinely beautiful, this mountain. You probably don't stop to appreciate it much. You're tired, your hands hurt. There's dinner to eat and tomorrow to prepare for. But somewhere in the back of your mind, there might be an awareness, a quiet knowledge, that you are doing something that will last. That the tunnel behind you, inching longer every day, is going to carry trains across this mountain long after you're gone. That what you're building is permanent, whether that was comfort enough for the wages you were paid and the risks you ran, is a question each of those men would have answered differently. I don't know what the right answer is. I'm not sure there is one. One of the most meaningful things happening in this area of history right now is the active effort to recover the names and stories of these workers. The Chinese Railroad Workers in North America project, based at Stanford University, spent years, from 2012 to 2019, systematically gathering every piece of evidence they could find about who these workers were. They searched American records, Chinese provincial archives, village genealogies, community organization documents, archaeological evidence. What they found was both illuminating and heartbreaking. The American records are almost useless for names. Chinese workers were listed as John Chinaman, or simply not listed at all. But the Chinese records are different. Genealogies kept by clans and villages in Guangdong actually recorded when family members went to Gold Mountain. These records sometimes listed names, dates of departure, and occasionally notes about what happened, whether the person returned, whether they died abroad, whether they sent money home. From these records, researchers have been able to recover actual names. Not thousands of them. The records are too fragmentary for that. But some. Real people with real names and real families. There's also the archaeological work. Sites along the old Central Pacific route are being surveyed and excavated. The physical evidence left behind, the specific types of ceramics, the food remains, the layout of the camps, the artifacts of daily life, fills in details that no written record captures. Researchers can now describe in specific detail what a Chinese railroad work camp looked like and how it functioned in ways that weren't possible even 20 years ago. This work matters because history is not just about famous people and dramatic events. History is also about ordinary people, living ordinary lives under extraordinary circumstances and recovering those lives, even partially, even incompletely, is an act of respect. These men deserved that respect in their lifetimes and didn't receive it. Getting it now, generations later, is better than nothing. But it's also a reminder of how long it takes for some histories to be told. Every generation finds in this story what it needs to find. And that's not a bad thing. People who are descendants of Chinese railroad workers find in it a source of pride and a source of grief simultaneously. Their ancestors built something extraordinary and were treated unjustly for it. Both of those things are true at the same time. People who study labor history find in it one of the earliest examples of organized Asian American labor action, the 1867 strike, and a reminder that the history of American workers is far more diverse and far more complicated than the dominant narratives often suggest. People who study immigration history find in it the origins of anti-Asian discrimination in America, the prejudice that led to the Chinese Exclusion Act and that echoes in different forms into the present. People who study engineering and construction find in it one of the most impressive physical achievements in American history, accomplished with tools and techniques that seem almost impossibly primitive by modern standards. And people who just want to understand what life was like for regular people in the 1860s find in it a story that is intimate and specific and deeply human. Young men far from home, working dangerous jobs, sending money to their families, building something that would outlast them by centuries. The Transcontinental Railroad still runs. You can take an Amtrak train today that roughly follows the old Central Pacific route over Donner Pass and down through the Sierra Nevada foothills into Sacramento. The tracks are not the same tracks. They've been replaced and upgraded many times over 150 years. But the route is the same. The tunnels, including the Summit Tunnel, are still in use. When that train passes through the Summit Tunnel, through that dark bore in the granite mountain that took years and cost lives and stood as one of the greatest engineering challenges of its era, it does so because of the Chinese workers who built it. It does so because of men whose names we largely don't know, who drilled and blasted and hauled and endured in conditions that no modern worker would accept, who went on strike to demand fair treatment and were ignored, who built the thing and then were excluded from the country that benefited from it. They deserve to be remembered, not just as a footnote, not just as a statistic, but as people. Why does any of this matter to you, watching this video in the 21st century? Here's my honest answer. Because the Transcontinental Railroad is one of the central founding myths of American identity. The idea of a nation connected coast to coast, the idea of manifest destiny made literal in iron and steam. This is deep in how Americans think about themselves and their history. And if that story is built on an incomplete foundation, if it leaves out the people who actually did the most essential and most dangerous work, then the story is wrong. Not just incomplete, but wrong in a way that shapes how we understand the present. The Chinese workers who built the Transcontinental Railroad were not background characters in someone else's story. They were the protagonists of their own story, and their story intersects with the American story in ways that are still working themselves out today. When we see anti-Asian discrimination in America, and we have seen it persistently across the decades, including in very recent years, it doesn't come from nowhere. It has a history. Part of that history is the story of the Chinese railroad workers. Men who were essential when their labor was needed and excluded when it wasn't. Understanding that history doesn't fix it, but not understanding it makes it impossible to address honestly. So let's come back to where we started. That image of a young man waking up before dawn, knowing the mountain is waiting. He gets up, he eats, he drinks his tea, he picks up his tools, he goes into the tunnel or to the cliff face or to the grading cut, and he works for 12 hours, and then he comes back, and he does it again tomorrow. He does this for months, for years. He sends money home when he can. He thinks about his family. He celebrates the new year with his crewmates. He watches men get hurt. He maybe watches men die. He goes on strike once in 1867, demanding basic fairness, and it doesn't work, not really. But he tried. He finishes the railroad. He moves on to other work. Maybe he goes home eventually. Maybe he stays. And then, in 1882, the country passes a law that says people like him are not welcome. His children, if they were born in China, cannot come. His community, which has been in California for 30 years, is officially classified as a threat. He doesn't get a monument. He doesn't get a mention in the speech at Promontory Summit. For most of the next century and a half, his name doesn't appear in the textbooks. But he built the railroad. That part is undeniable, whatever the textbooks say or don't say. The granite tunnel stands. The grades over the Sierra Nevada stand. The foundation of the western half of the Transcontinental Railroad, that stands. And now, slowly, the story is being told more fully. Not because it finally became convenient, not because it suddenly became palatable, but because enough people decided that the incomplete story was a lie, and that the truth, complicated and uncomfortable as it is, deserved to be spoken. This video is part of that. Imperfect, incomplete, but trying. If this story resonated with you, I want to ask you to do something before you click away. Look up the Chinese Railroad Workers in North America project. The work they've done at Stanford to document these workers is genuinely impressive and genuinely moving. If you want to go deeper into this history, their published research is some of the best available. If you're in California, Cape Horn, near the town of Colfax in Placer County, is accessible and worth visiting. You can stand at the edge of that canyon and look at the cliff face where men were suspended in baskets drilling into granite. It's a very different experience from reading about it. The next time you see something about anti-Asian discrimination in America, and it comes up, it keeps coming up, remember that there's a history behind it that goes back to the 1800s. The Chinese Exclusion Act didn't come out of nowhere, and understanding where it came from is the first step to understanding why its echoes are still with us. And if this is a piece of history you didn't know well before watching this video, please share it. Not for the algorithm, not for the numbers, but because these men lived and worked and were largely forgotten, and the least we can do is make sure more people know their story. Subscribe if you want to see more history told this way. From the ground level, from the perspective of the people who actually did the work, lived the lives, and often got left out of the version of history that made it into the textbooks. There are a lot more stories like this one. Some of them are just as surprising. Some of them are just as important. See you in the next one.